My name is Solitaire Townsend, and I can tell you something. If you want to work in communications and storytelling, being called Solitaire is fantastic because everyone always remembers it. Unless, of course, they're old enough to know what James Bond girl you're named after, in which case it's not so cool. If anyone's got a pick-up line that I haven't heard, I would be impressed. I am co-founder and chief solutionist here at Futerra, and Futerra is an agency. We work with large organizations, we work with small organizations, we work with businesses and brands and studios, we work with storytellers, we work with entrepreneurs, we work with individuals. And one of the things which has been core to Futerra for the last 21 years is storytelling. So I'm so pleased that you're here. Now, this space that you're in is probably one of the only spaces that you'll visit during this week where in a week today, next Monday, there will be as many conversations about climate change happening in this room as there is today. Because this is Futerra's office. Literally a couple of days ago, we pulled all the desks and the chairs out and we turned our office into an event space. So this is a working space, like climate solutions are built into the brick. Like you're going to pick up on the vibe of Futerra in this room. It also means you're not sitting in darkness with a lit stage. There's a bit of natural light coming in. There's going to be pings from the elevators. Also, you may find something brush against your ankles. That is Tagada, the Solutions House dog. Tagada, the Solutions House dog, is usually Tagada, the Futerra office dog, and this is her home. Tagada is French, and so if she jumps up at you, you can't say no, you have to say non. Genuinely true, she ignores you if you say no, you have to say non. And she's the most Instagram-worthy thing in this place. So I have a deep passion for storytelling. I was saying in the previous session, I'm probably one of the only people in the world who's got a postgraduate master's degree in sustainability and a postgraduate master's degree in Shakespeare. And I said that means how incredibly dull I was as a young woman. But those master's degrees were not part of my destiny, because when I was about 12, I was very, very, very dyslexic, which we didn't know at the time. I couldn't read and I couldn't write, and I wasn't in mainstream school. Back then in the 70s, it was in kind of special school for children who had educational learning difficulties. And I had an accident and I was in hospital again, think back a couple of decades, there was no mobile phones, there was no TVs in hospitals, parents couldn't come to visit, and I wasn't on a children's ward, I was on an adult ward. And I was in traction, I wasn't in very much pain, and I was bored out of my mind. Days went past and days went past, surrounded by quite ill people, not being able to chat, not being able to do anything. And eventually, pulling on my little wheelchair, I found a library. There was no children's books, there was nothing to draw on or anything which I did. All there were adult books. And so over the coming 6 months, I taught myself to read out of sheer, absolute desperation. Because it turns out that before mobile phones, life was very dull. And those books opened a world to me that I hadn't known existed. And in fact, the first ever book I read was Cider with Rosie. The second ever book I read was Lord of the Rings. The third ever book I read was Tale of Two Cities. And the fourth ever book I read was Jilly Cooper's Riders. If that probably says a lot about who I am as a person. I think I probably enjoyed Jilly Cooper's Riders the best. And I share that story because we're here to talk about climate change and storytelling. And a lot of times when people are talking about climate change and storytelling, they treat story as if it was merely a vehicle for a message. We need to use story to change people. We've got to use story to get the message out there. We've got to use story to educate. Somehow story needs to be in service of the science. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that makes great storytelling. I don't think that makes great sense, because story for me in itself is actually a human right. our ability to imagine, to share those imaginations with everybody, is in itself inherently sustainable. When you are reading a book, when you are watching a movie, when you are participating in story, you're doing one of the most sustainable things that there are, one of the least direct impact things that there are, and one of the most truly human things that you can do. So I wanted to set that up before we vote, because I don't want any questions about how we can better use story to educate the public. I don't want any questions about how storytellers can become the sort of shock troops of the climate movement to get the message out there. We want to talk about how climate change is, of course, part of the story of the 21st century, and solving it is maybe one of the best and biggest epics there will ever be. That there is a very natural connection between story and between climate that we can lean into. And perhaps one of the problems up until now is that we've been making really bad stories about climate change, when in fact we should be making really, really great stories that actually end up solving climate change. So sorry for that little bit of a boom, but totally freaked Tagada out. So to join, no, you didn't actually, to join me up here to have this incredible conversation, I would love to invite Kat Coiro, who I am both incredibly impressed with, and I'm such a huge Hulk fan. I'm also really intimidated to have her because she's the director of Hulk. Kat, please come up and join me on stage. I'd like to invite Tory Stevens. Now, Tory doesn't know this. He's the climate fiction manager at Grist, but I have been stalking him for some time, and it took us having an event like this for me to be able to feel that I had something to offer in terms of texting him and that he wasn't just going to ignore me. So, Tory, I'm a fangirl. Please come up and join. Thank you. And Ali Weinstein, who's the co-founder of the Hollywood Climate Summit and is also a TV writer. Like, of course I'm a fangirl, but I also think of you as a friend. So if Ali from Hollywood Climate Summit could come up and join me. So I've got some... Okay, someone picked Tagada up because the online audience have been making lots and lots of comments about not seeing Tagada. So here we go. The star of Solutions House, the reason why we are the place to be.
Such a cute dog.
Merci, Tagada. Okay, so I've got some questions prepared for you, but the first thing, this is completely ruined. I can't remember anything I was going to say. It's all about the dog. So what I'd like to actually just start with is, before we go deep into the whys and the wherefores and what you do, as you maybe introduce yourselves and say a little bit more, can you just say about what story means to you? Like why story? I'm going to come to you first, Ali.
Oh man, okay. Hi, my name is Ali Weinstein. My pronouns are she, her. I am one of the co-founders, executive producers, and this year's director of programming of the Hollywood Climate Summit. I am also a currently on strike TV writer, and I will add that labor and climate are intricately linked. And I've worked on shows like the spin-off of Orphan Black, a spin-off of Law and Order, a show called Glamorous, and I am also a consultant for the company Good Energy. Woo! And so, I think I feel similarly to you, Solly. It's like, I think I'm an only child. I was very imaginative from a very young age. I was always imagining new worlds and I was a very avid reader and continue to be to this day. And my dad is also a type of storyteller, and so I feel like I really grew up imagining new worlds. And in high school, I started writing screenplays, and literally all the screenplays I wrote from high school through college were grounded sci-fi about climate. And so I think I've always seen story as a way to inspire, but also to create worlds that you feel at home in and that you see yourself in, and that has immense power, and that kind of, I think, has been shifted into all of the work that I do today. Even if that, some of the stories I wrote a long time ago are not necessarily like the ones that I advocate for right now. I think that essence of kind of like the joy and the engagement that you can create through a story is what has always motivated me to write the things that I write, and also authentic representation, both in climate, in terms of identity too, is a big factor.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Tory, coming to you, maybe you could say a little bit about what you're doing at Grist, and then what story means to you.
All right. So I'm Tory Stevens. I use he, him pronouns, and I work at Grist magazine and manage their climate fiction initiative called Imagine 2200. So we've been doing this for a few years now, and I came from the storytelling world of development. So really was interested in really bringing characters to life when a lot of folks were interested in telling stories around statistics and how many people we've helped. Like, it was always about the big number. And I was always about that person who was hurting, I really wanted, I'm a character-driven person, love stories, love world building, but the characters are what drive me and what really, I'm like rooting for that person, and I'm like on my couch kind of sobbing, like if I go through it, like the character. And where I got that from is when I was younger, I was evangelical. I'm not anymore, I've moved away from the church, but I would say that I was sheltered in a big way. Like, the stories that I was consuming and the types of stories that I knew were like very much the Bible. My mom did not have many books in her house. And so my way out was comic books. The X-Men was like a really big one for me. And like, I was really, the diverse world that story told drew me in, and I loved the characters, and I was introduced to disabled characters, Black characters, what I believed to be like queer characters at the time, who were like the hidden queer ones. And like, so like for me, like it was, I love a good story like everyone, but it's the characters that, you can have great world building, but if those characters don't feel culturally authentic to the story, then I'm not going to be grabbed by that. And so that's kind of like where I fell in love with story, and that's what I hope with Imagine 2200. We offer a platform for people to tell culturally authentic stories that are character driven.
Brilliant, thank you so much. So Kat, your amazing movie Marry Me made me cry, and She-Hulk made me more than once go hell yeah at the TV, which was kind of embarrassing alone in my flat. But you are a storyteller and you're a filmmaker. In terms of your journey, like I feel strange asking this considering your incredible portfolio, but what does story mean to you?
To me, story is community, and it's communion. And there are times when it is, a way that I can connect to my children or my friends. There are times when it is an escape. There are times when it is it is a teaching tool that can help you look into worlds that maybe you don't know about, maybe you are curious about. And I think it's also therapy. I often look at, especially the comic book world and some of these mythological stories, as a way for us as humankind to work through universal struggles and truths and see that we're not alone, and that a lot of these journeys have been happening since the beginning of recorded human history. And I think that feeling of communion is the most important thing to me, whether it's fluffy and fun or deep and meaningful.
I love that. So story as community. Brilliant. Ali, coming to you, I was talking a little bit about the role of, by the way, this is the first time Taggart has come on stage. This is where she lives now. I talked a little bit about kind of being quite passionate that the role of storytelling isn't to serve the science, but of course when we're thinking about climate change, there is obviously an intersection between the science and between story. In terms of like, how do you navigate that, the intrinsic necessity of story to be itself, and then trying to weave in themes and tropes of climate?
I mean, I think that, to me, how I think of climate storytelling, it's like climate storytelling as a phrase is a bit misleading. It kind of makes it feel like its own separate genre of storytelling, when the reality is myself and a lot of other people in the space feel like every single story should be a climate story, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. But live in the
Sorry, for those who are watching online, Tagada is now creating crime and going into people's handbags. So, but by Friday, this is going to be all over. Please, Ali. So,
but that, you know, we are living in the climate crisis every day. There is not a person on Earth that is not affected in some way, shape, or form by the climate crisis. And if we want our stories to be authentic and to be representing our lived reality, which I think is what a lot of people look for from stories, and which I think is evident in all of our answers of why stories have been inspiring to us, you know, then not seeing climate in those stories, and this is what Dorothy Fortenberry says, another TV writer, makes those stories the science fiction. You know, if they're not accurately representing what we are living through every day. But the flip side of that is, you know, I really advocate for those stories to be joyful, to have a lot of different intersections of themes and genres, because, you know, we talk about a lot of really scary, hard things all the time. There's a million TV shows and movies about death that are funny, that include romance, that, you know, and it's like, that's a very anxiety-inducing topic, but we're still able to talk about it in a way that includes all those other perspectives, and that's a more accurate version of how we live our day-to-day lives. So it's like, that's what I personally really try to infuse into this idea of adding climate to story is, you know, how are we looking at it as a part of our lived reality already, and how can we make that, you know, how can we make that entertaining? It doesn't have to be this like doom and gloom apocalyptic perspective. And in many ways that, you know, we've shown that creates a lot of apathy. So I think the storytelling movement with climate is moving more towards integrating it in a very natural way for storytellers that feels authentic to their lived realities, as well as, you know, including those lighter subject matters with it.
yeah, I love that. I often think that for too long, climate storytelling has been like a dopamine-free zone. Like, you will not feel, you will only think. And if you do feel, you only get to be afraid. And that actually, that's not in any way reflecting the massive diversity of climate and storytelling. So Troy, you probably read more climate storytelling than anyone else I know, in terms of all the content that gets submitted, the incredible awards you've given, the competitions that you've run. Are you noticing any tropes or any themes that are emerging in the climate storytelling that Grist is giving this incredible platform to?
Yeah, I would say that in this one's a sad one. I won't end on a sad one, but a lot of folks submit what I would say is, you know, fascist work. You know, and they don't know it. They, you know, because I think that they're submitting to the contest because they believe in kind of the ideals that the climate movement is pushing and, you know, wants in society. But, you know, less birth rates, population control, like I see that's not the bulk of our stories, but I do see like a trend of them that we, you know, those stories immediately get, you know, we won't publish those kind of stories, and they don't make it far in the process. Other things that we see, though, that are more, you know, happy and uplifting is after we've dealt with the climate crisis, you know, it's not that we live in this like utopia. There's like interpersonal problems that we're still going to have, and we have to navigate those. So there's a lot of stories where, you know, folks are living collectively, and they're still navigating, you know, how it is to kind of live in a society where you're all like, you know, living very close with each other and have different perspectives and come from different backgrounds. Another one that I see is farming. Food kind of ties people together, and we advocate and put out there that we want culturally authentic stories, and like I think a way that people lean into that it's like an easier way is that they kind of like seed the stories with a lot of food. So I think that's great, but I think that's great, but I want people to kind of like the whole breadth of like a culture. So for folks online or anyone who's writing, if you're writing a story that's about culture, really bring in like all the culture. And I really like, so I'm talking the traditions, the religion. Don't shy away from religion either. Yeah. There's a lot of stories that are, you know, people shy away from the religion that not all of us, but a lot of people have. And I think it's really important that climate fiction stories have religion in, because people, that drives people, and people live that life too. And so since people, I would say kind of like, people who submit, I would say just because of reading them, that they come from like a more left side of things. it doesn't mean you can't, have like a character that like, has deep felt faith in their storytelling. So that's another aspect of culture that you could bring in. And then marginalized cultures, like folks that have like, really oppressed and marginalized, like those characters, we want to see them in our stories. And they have cultures that, be careful with this, I would say, because if it's not your culture, I'm not an advocate that says that you can't write about folks that you're not from that race or that culture or gender. I think that's important for people to explore in their writing. But you better be in community with those folks, and you better, like, you could research the hell out of it, but like, I really think it comes from community is like the way you're going to be able to write that authentically. And so that's another piece about culture that I think is really important.
Brilliant. I love all those positives and that what you're looking for in terms of a great story. And I would like on this panel for us to come back though to that sort of basic fascism that can come through in quite a lot of the climate story, which maybe, hopefully, is not intentional in a lot of the story that's come from the climate movement. But I think a lot of times we don't understand how the story that we tell might not be being heard in the way in which it was intended. And that's been a real problem for decades. A bunch of basically white people telling the rest of the world how to live their lives in the story. Kat, I'm going to ask you a really basic question. A lot of people in this room are story experts, but a lot of people at Climate Week are not. And Climate Week is a lot of activists, a lot of scientists, a lot of corporate change makers. You've got a lot of technical, logic, left brain thinkers who are here and who are online. And many of them desperately want to be better storytellers and want to be able to be more compelling in how they get this across. So, what do you look for in a good story? Like, what makes a good story for you when you see a script, when you see a story? What for you makes it sing? Like, give the folks a 101.
For me, it really is character-based. And when I go into picking a project, I look at the characters, and I think, is this something that I can see in a really well-rounded way and bring to life? And interestingly, my work in the environmental space is, it started on Marry Me, which is, obviously, I love those characters because it's very aspirational, it's very romantic. It really has nothing to do with the environment, but I wanted to make a sustainable set. And at the time, it was out of the range with our budget because we actually had a pretty small budget. And so I said, what can I control? What can I do? And I took away single-use plastic and unnecessary waste from the screen. It might not even be something you notice when you watch the movie. It is subliminal. And after doing that on Marry Me, I hooked up with a foundation called Habits of Waste. And we created the initiative Lights, Camera, Plastic. And so every project I've done since Marry Me, including She-Hulk, including a lot of things now, we don't try to affect the audience or send a message through story as much as through subliminal messaging. There are no water bottles. There is only if it helps story, which 99.9% of the time it doesn't, is there anything that is wasteful on the screen. And we look at smoking and the way it was handled in Hollywood for many years and the way it affected the population as our template for the change that we're making, which is if we remove single-use plastic, if we make it something that doesn't feel right to look at, it will influence people's choices. And so that kind of brings me back to what you're saying, which is that for me, a story has to grip me. It has to be something I can relate to. I've read amazing scripts that I have to pass on because I can't find the in from a personal point of view, whatever that may be. With She-Hulk, it was so much about what it means to be a woman and walk down a dark alley and feel fear. And gosh, wouldn't it be cool to communicate that to the world? Because it's something that, most men don't understand. And it was really fun to explore that idea of being able to turn into a huge, muscular woman who could kick anybody's ass. And that, and it was a character I'd always loved. So I really approach it through character and how can I sink my teeth in and how can it be really exciting to me. And that's why you see my work is very varied It's kind of all over the place, but the characters are characters that I love and can relate to.
That's such a huge learning for the climate community, because the climate community tends to try to distance itself from the personal. It's all about these universal facts and truths, these sort of big strategies, this very, very left brain. And it's almost as if, like, do you remember at university you weren't allowed to say I when you were writing an essay? You couldn't say I think or I believe or I read. You had to make everything as if you were speaking in this sort of like universal piece. And I think that that's hung over into the climate community a lot. And very, very rarely do you ever have anyone talk about them, what they feel, why they are doing this, what they're passionate about, what their story is. And when I tell folks in the climate community that it's okay, you can do that, you can see this great nervousness of going, yes, but it's not about me, it's about climate change, and going, yeah, but climate change is just made up of a whole load of me's. That's what it is. It's a whole load of individual billions of people. That's all climate change is. And so I think that's a massive, massive message. Thank you for that, Kat.
Well, and it becomes academic, what you're saying.
Yeah.
And really, storytelling has to be visceral.
Yeah.
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 And I think additionally, you know, it can be overwhelming if you don't think of yourself as a storyteller to hear from the people on this stage who have done a lot of different types of storytelling and have trained in it and all of these things. But the reality is we tell stories every single day. Like, you come home and you tell your partner the story of what your day was. You know, it's like, it doesn't have to be something that's complicated. And I think that's where everyone should start, is like, why are you passionate about the thing that you have been doing research on for 20 years? Like, that's really where that story begins. And every single, you know, the way that we all see the climate crisis right now is because we've all told stories to each other about it. And there's a lot of people in power that have twisted that story to be what they want it to be. So it's like, how do you reclaim the story that you want to tell about the climate crisis?
Oh, yeah. In fact, I think it's something crazy, like 75% of our conversations when we're being human beings are stories. We just tell each other anecdotes all day.
Yeah.
And that every human being is a storyteller.
Yeah.
Like, you can't function as a human being if you're not.
Right.
Tory, like, obviously Grist is very known for extremely good factual reporting of what's going on. And, you know, how does it work inside Grist? Like, what was Grist's motivation to kind of go, actually, let's create a whole section of what we do about story?
Yeah, this is a pandemic story in some way. It started before the pandemic, but I don't know if folks know this, but Grist has a list, kind of like, you know, Forbes has a list, but ours is focused on climate and sustainability and not capitalism. So we've had that list since 2015, and 50 people are nominated, and then we have a whole process where we go through that list. And at one point, we were having retreats where we invited folks to have small closed-door dinners, and we would talk about things. And so we put it to the group, and we just said, I want you to go off into small groups and pitch an idea to the rest of the people in your group, and then select the one that you think is the best that you want to pitch in front of the whole room. So then I think there was like 5 groups. They came up, and one group had climate fiction as, like, they were like, you all already have editors, you're like in the literary space, like people love books, like why don't you review books? And like they're just like, you know, brainstorming and throwing out ideas. And so then we went back to the office and we thought, that's a great idea. And we had already been thinking about climate fiction. And so then we tested it, like we just like in the office, like what do people think informally? But then we did a really pivotal thing, and I'm really happy and proud that we did this. We invited another class of Grist 50 Years together to talk about what type of climate fiction. Not just we're gonna do climate fiction, but what kind of climate fiction. So there was a lot of justice leaders in the room. There were a lot of like solution-minded folk. And at the end, there was, you know, folks who were like screaming for climate fiction that has like land back, reparations, the climate fiction that has disabled characters, like just climate fiction that's intersectional. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I was kind of like blown back, like this is like, you know, getting all like red-faced, like in like a positive way. And I was just like, this is brilliant, let's do it. And so pitched it inside of Grist, and they said, let's greenlight it, let's try it. Yeah. And after the first year, we had like a pretty good audience, which surprisingly was not the audience that Grist has. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The news folks they dabble in Imagine 2200, but they're not our core audience. It was a whole new cohort of people that don't know Grist and don't read Grist. Because as one woman told me at a book event the other day, I don't do news. I don't get my orientation from news. I think she listed like 5 different, she was like, it's negative, it's divisive, and it, it irks me. And I was like, wow, you don't do news? And like, because I don't know, I'm not a news junkie, but I do the news. And like, those folks who don't do news is a whole new audience for Grist, who, which is kind of interesting as a news organization. But yeah, there's just a good amount of people who get their orientation just through fiction and care about the climate too, but just want a good story as opposed to like a news story.
I'm so pleased you raised this. So in the panel before, Mark, who is here from Earth Alliance, was talking about some research they'd done in terms of climate audiences, and the fact that what they found was like at least 50% of the audiences that they've been talking to don't do news. And if you don't do news, you don't get climate. Because basically climate is almost entirely, the climate conversation is almost entirely covered of news or news adjacent content. And then actually in fiction content, there isn't very much around climate. And so these were folks who had some, positive feelings about needing to do it. But who in this room doesn't consume news? Is there anyone in this room who doesn't consume news? Thank you very much, madam. And I greatly respect you putting the hand up, because I suspect there's a couple of others but who are like, are you kidding me? I'm not going to put my hand up in this room. That means that this room is completely unrepresentative of the rest of human beings. So we are making our decisions, making choices. There's a great deal of power in rooms like this around what's going to happen around climate, and we are not representative of most of the rest of our fellow human beings who do not consume news, and that's not a bad thing, and we don't need to go out there and convince them to, but that is why story is so, so crucial. Now, I had an argument on this stage last year with a wonderful, renowned scientist when I told him that all the evidence shows that someone will believe an anecdote, a story, over a fact. So if you've gone and done all your research about the car you want to buy, you've gone online, you've done the comparisons, you've done all the maths, you've worked it out, you've made your decision that there's a particular EV you're going to buy, and you've used a lot of left brain, very, very logical thinking to do so. And if you go into work the next day and some guy that you don't even like very much at the coffee table says, oh, you don't want to do that, mate. My brother's cousin uncle, terrible maintenance costs. No. All the evidence would show you won't buy the car. Because even though you've done all your research, that one single anecdote from somebody who's almost a stranger and is talking about someone who's definitely a stranger, you're humanly programmed to believe that anecdote from another human being over evidence. And the person who I was telling this to, the scientist I was telling to, said, no, that's absolutely not the case. I was like, dude, climate deniers, you're being a story denier. It's that I think in the climate movement, there's this deeply held belief that if we could just communicate the science more, that people would take that decision and would start acting on it. Now, Ali, the work that you've been doing with the Hollywood Climate Summit has in many ways been communicating some of the science to the storytelling community. Mm-hmm. How much more do you think we need to do to communicate the story to the climate community?
Ooh. I think it's kind of like a cyclical reality. I think we do need to do a lot of work, because I think, I've met people who are tech innovators, scientists, et cetera, who are working on things, and they tell me, I'm frustrated that no one has ever heard of what I'm doing when it's really important. And I agree with them, it's really important, but it's partially because we are not necessarily training scientists to be storytellers, like I said previously. And I do think that it's like you can't get that to a wider audience unless you are shifting the way that we are putting that science out into the world. And I agree that we are going to more often relate to a character that happens to be integrating that knowledge into something that's very crucial to what they're doing in life than we are to someone, rattling off a fact about something. And I do think a lot to what you're saying about anecdotes is due to trust, right? And I think that kind of brings back the core of what we do at the Hollywood Climate Summit is to bring together community. Mm-hmm. And you are way more likely to, I think, engage in a scientific reality if the rest of your community is also doing that. And that's the case. not to necessarily jump into politics, but I think that's like the case with a lot of like political realities, is like your community believes a certain thing, you feel really connected to and trusted and ingrained in that community, and you are far less likely to be maybe the one person who steps outside of that because you don't want to be ostracized from your community. And so I think so much of it is community building and that foundation that is going to get people to engage in the science of it more, and that is partially about bringing scientists into those communities. So it's like, how do we bring scientists? We always want scientists to come to the Hollywood Climate Summit. We have so much to learn from them, and I think they have a lot to learn from us about how we are putting that information out into the world. So I think it's more, I feel like it's about inviting the scientists into those other storytelling communities.
Brilliant. Let's build that community. Kat, and I'm going to come to the audience immediately after this question, both the in-the-room audience and the online audience. So please do get your questions coming in online. So we're also talking about an industry here. So storytelling is a universal, it's something which we all do, it's part of everybody's human experience, but there's also folks who it's their professional job to do so. And it's quite a large industry and it's got lots of different parts. Are you seeing within the industry of which you're a part more of this conversation? Are writers, are filmmakers, are creatives thinking about climate from a storytelling perspective? Or is it something that folks are still a bit afraid of, that they don't quite know how to enter into?
At Habits of Waste, our motto, I would say, is to give people small, actionable items that can kind of become the gateway to larger environmental action. And sometimes it's just having those conversations. With Lights, Camera, Plastic, when I started production, I say, hey, I really hate plastic water bottles, and I hate seeing unnecessary waste on screen. And more than half of the people in the room will get really excited because it's something that they can do. And I think we all feel a little disheartened, and the problems are so big. And if you look at the industry and go, okay, we're gonna, make all the truck fleets electric and we're gonna eliminate all the waste that movies make, it can feel rather daunting. Yeah. And so we've been focusing on what are the small things that don't necessarily cost the production money, that can make people feel like they make a difference. And I think that's one of the biggest things, is making people feel like they can do something, and it doesn't feel insurmountable. And again, that brings us back to community. Yeah. And so, in my productions, what's been exciting is just having those conversations. And I will never say to a writer, I want this story to be sustainable. What I will say is, hey, this moment here would necessitate me using something that I don't really want to put on screen because kids are going to see this. Yeah. Can you come up with 10 different things? Yeah. And if none of them work, we will do what you did. Yeah. And what we found is most of the time, they'll come up with something cooler and better. And then it's kind of sparks these conversations that extend into all areas. And I hope that one day we can make the industry totally sustainable. But if for now what we're doing is just having that conversation about plastic water bottles, it's a start.
It's a start. It's a way in. And I love that last mile, because we do quite a lot of work with creatives in terms of social media creators and writers and studios. And what we find is that people, you don't have to convince them anymore. Like they already care. They don't want to be told to care anymore. They want to know, what should I do? Like, what is the thing I can do? And I think that is a moment in time that we're in, which is brilliant. Okay, so over to you. For hands straight up. Give me a moment. Here's a comment. And as always, sir, it is your choice of who gets to ask a question.
Hi, Amit Minhas, JP Morgan. Just two questions. What will be the format of these stories? Is it going to be features versus streaming? And storytelling takes money, and JP Morgan has set aside some funds for climate initiatives. What pools of capital are you seeking or targeting?
Wow. Okay. Pitch. It happened here.
Yeah. I work normally in the studio system. I work in very commercial, kind of entertaining mediums, and so for me, it's more about what I'm putting on the screen in terms of waste, and less about actual stories about climate change. But that's just me.
I mean, yeah, I think if every story is a climate story, those stories are showing up in every type of media. And I think of media very broadly. I think of it as TV shows. I think of it as films, but I also think of it as social media. I think of it as podcasts. I think of it as journalism. Like, it really, should be showing up in all of those facets, and all of those facets currently intersect. Like, Hollywood doesn't look at media as just the TV show they're making or the film they're making. They look at it as the article that they found 3 years ago that they optioned that was like 3 pages, and they turned it into the next hit TV show. Also, video games. I really appreciate that was mentioned on the last panel. The last thing I worked on before the strike was I was a writer on a video game because I had climate knowledge, and they wanted to infiltrate that into their world building. So it's like, I do think there's a lot of different avenues, but I will say I encourage everyone, as they're kind of getting into the climate storytelling space, this is what we're trying to do within Hollywood as well, is like acknowledge the practices of where that is coming from, and it's like, it would be hypocritical to put something on screen that, is not, that is pushing forward the climate agenda when you're not changing your internal structures to reflect that.
Brilliant. I'm just going to add one thing, which is there are some amazing storytellers in the Global South who do not have access to the kind of funding that perhaps even here on this platform we have, and that there is, if we could raise some of those stories and those characters up, that, like, if you've got funding, I can tell you where to put it. So we've had a really interesting question that's come in online about sort of, the protagonist, antagonist, the hero, the villain. And of course, when it comes to climate change, we are kind of both. Everybody has contributed, many people to a very, very, very minor level, many people to an extraordinarily high level, and everybody needs to be part of solving it as well. To change everything will take everyone. So how do we tell this story around climate if we actually do want to actually get into climate storytelling rather than climate in story, so climate storytelling? Like, how do we navigate this challenge of kind of talking about people both being the hero and the villain of this story? And of course, again, with the great acknowledgement that there are many, many people around the world who have a very, very small impact on the climate. But here in the US, a significant proportion of people have quite a large impact. And is this one of the things which are holding people back from climate storytelling? Because, telling people they're bad isn't a great story.
The place I go is, I guess, like, the place I go is, like, I definitely love receiving stories because I don't have all the answers. So create platforms for people to tell, like, to work out how they can be better, how they can do better, how they can become more sustainable, or read something where folks are doing that in their stories. So I always go to the place of, like, we just need to open the floodgates so that more people can tell their story. Yeah. And so I don't have the answers. I don't have the answer to that question. I mean, some part of me kind of wants to go in the direction of, it is unequal, and I want to point the fingers at the fossil fuel executives and the folks that are making, like, tell more stories about that antagonist.
Yes.
And stop telling the story about how we are doing these, like, small, not micro, but, like, even bigger if we're in, like, the Western world, just because of our impact. But still, I want to hear more stories. Like, there's not that many climate stories already, so, like, more stories that reflect that inequality of, like, where the decision making and power resides. Yeah. I think is really important. So there's something about that question that just irks me a tiny bit, even though I know what they're saying. No. It's just, that's where my mind goes.
Oh no, I'm 100% with you. There was an amazing series recently, a whole series, I won't say who or by, where the bad guy was a tech leader, and I was like going, dude, Shell is right there. It's like, we do have some increasingly bad guys within this industry.
Yeah, and I do think I try to encourage people to make that bad guy the fossil fuel industry, but I think also, the stories that are most relatable are imperfect people. Like, none of us are perfect, and the reason that we feel this individual onus to fight the climate crisis individually is because of a story that the fossil fuel industry told us.
Right.
So it's like it's like we really have to think backwards in that way, and So I love complicated characters. We should be seeing people who are making mistakes when it comes to climate, because that's what's relatable. None of us are perfect. And like we actually, the Hollywood Climate Summit has a training program called Climate Ambassadors. And when I lead that program, I always start out with people sharing kind of these like climate faux pas that they do every day, these climate confessions. So we all go around and we say how we ordered something from Amazon yesterday. We took a really long shower, just to get it normalized that like none of us are perfect in this movement, and that's not what it's about.
We've had a really interesting question, and Kat, I'm going to send this on to you. In terms of, we're talking a lot about climate here and about plastic and about waste. What about nature? So one of the things which we're so aware of is that we're in the great sixth extinction. We're in as much of a biodiversity crisis as a climate crisis. They are the same frigging crisis because they're caused by the same stuff. How can we weave in a more closeness to nature? And I noticed a lot of that in She-Hulk in terms of there being this urban environment and there being a much more nature-based environment that people spent time on. How can we make that more normal as you're normalizing other behaviors?
I'm here this week. Actually, I came to stand in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en, who are from northern British Columbia, and their land has a pipeline in their sacred river. This is a shield that they made me, and they were here to stand up, and not fight, but to tell their story, which is that the funding, from a lot of banks that we use, is being used to destroy their land. And when I went up to the territory last year, I was expecting to go and meet some really nice people who were protecting their land. And what I learned on a very deep level was they are not protecting their land. They are protecting everything downstream, which is our land. Yeah. And I felt this incredibly deep moment of revelation, which is that we talk a lot about how tech is going to save us, but if we look to the way a lot of indigenous people live, the answers are there, and there are people living off the land and drinking the water. And we have become so disconnected from that we forget sometimes that all the answers are there.
Yeah. Sir, let's fund that. Can we, Chris, this lady here has been waiting for a while. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hi, Beth Blissman, Loretto Community. I work as a United Nations representative. I'm the one who raised my hand. I don't take in news. I'm a religion PhD. Okay. The stories we tell are incredibly important. I don't have to look for it because it finds me what I need to know. And what you just said, Kat, is profound. I hope everyone takes that in and writes stories about it. The disconnection that we have from nature, from ourselves, and from food, for example. I actually have a question for you, Tory. You mentioned in, what's it called, Imagine 2200?
That's correct.
Yeah, I'm not a Grist subscriber, but you have my interest now. I'll definitely check that out.
One more.
You said some people approach it through food, and they weave in food. Well, I'm just curious, because food systems are connected to nature and biodiversity and economic systems very intricately. And I'm just curious, are people going there yet with circular economy, connecting that to food and then imagining new systems? Because if it's one thing that's clear right now happening over at the UN, we're halfway through from 2015 to 2030, halfway through trying to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and we have maybe 12 to 15% of them
we're
that are
going
on
to
track.
take that in terms of how are we building in food and the circular economy. And I've read some of your stories. They are.
Yeah, there's
And
definitely
education.
Yeah, I would say that all those things are represented in the stories, but I would definitely say like the food and the economy kind of piece and sustainability and sustainable or sustainable in solidarity economies are represented. A story that I can name is Seven Sisters. That's in our collection. One thing about the stories that we publish, they're all for free. There's no, we don't like gate any of the content. That's the same for Grist on the news side of things as well, because we think that this information is useful and everyone should have it for free. So we receive those stories. There's people are making those connections. Seven Sisters is about a sustainable tea farm that mostly women are farming, and they come across some problems. Their drone is down, and their drone repair person gets sick. and it's about caring for each other. So a lot of healing justice in that story. There's other stories that bring in like the healing justice side of things, but I would say there's economics is not far from these stories. It's done in ways that it's not an economic story. It's a story about characters, and they have financial problems or issues that crop up. And it's more on that level, and the kind of global connectedness that you get from the story is less in the story, but it's there. It's there.
Brilliant. Thank you. Any other questions?
Hi, thanks for your talk. So I'm with the Hip Hop Caucus, and we also work with the Center for Cultural Power.
Can we just have a second?
Thank you. And of course, we're at Hollywood Climate Summit, so thanks for hosting us there. My question to you all is, one, we talked about news, but it feels like, so to become a good writer, like there's good writing and there's good storytelling just in general, and then looking at it with a climate lens. So what is the disconnect between using current events or news or something else to inform good writing or good storytelling, just like anything in any other genre? And then two, how do you all struggle with the paradox between you don't want to create just climate stories because they want to be intersectional, but you do want to communicate climate as an issue within stories? So I know that's been like part of the panel, but like I want to kind of get to that more succinctly. That's something that we and our organizations are struggling with too, like figuring out how to like bridge that gap.
Yeah. Kat, maybe you want to go, because you talked a lot about character as being like this pivot between the two.
Well, like I said, I don't necessarily tell climate change stories. Of course, my stories exist in the modern world, so they will touch upon them, but that is never, it's not the way that I approach stories. So I've found ways to make a more sustainable industry, if you will, rather than focusing the story on climate change or sustainability. But that's just me, and that's because that's what I can do.
Yeah.
And so I would say that personalization is the most important thing. And yeah, like you said, living in the real world. The science fiction now are things where these worries are not a part of our life.
Tory?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I talk about a lot, is I think a hope is a place that you can start when on the science side of things, those folks are operating from a place, like they're trying to get that information out there because, they have a hope that if they get the information out there, people act on it. And what I encourage people to do is to have like deep conversations around hope. So it might sound weird, but I ask like friends of mine, family members, like, what does hope mean to you? Because I want to find a common ground with them around that word. So like the same with climate change, the same with story, investigating it collectively. I think that's like really important. And I don't know if I'm like totally answering your question, because it's the same thing we're wrangling with too. And it's like, it's hard. But doing it in community, I think, is the best way to kind of like work that out. Bring that question in, make it live, make it a live discussion for other folks like you are with us. Just keep hammering at it and keep asking that question, because it's something that I like. I'd be down to join you in discussing that. Like, yeah, it's just something that like I'm still trying to work through as well.
And searching for the conversation rather than the answer, I think also. Like if you're looking for the answer, you're not going to find it. Nobody has the answer. But if you're looking for conversation with people who are inspiring to you, and my little one piece of advice for, if you want to tell a story is that to write, you have to write. And it's the hardest thing. Just start writing something every day. Set a timer for 10 minutes and start writing those conversations rather than the answers.
And I think to kind of potentially bring both of those questions together is, I think, something that holds people up from telling stories about climate is that they are thinking of it as this humongous concept. And that just freezes people, like it creates a lot of apathy. I think we are told about climate in a very large and complicated way, and so no one knows what their way in is, even from a storytelling perspective. And Tory touched on this too, and I agree with you about like it is about the conversation. So it's like, how do we portray more intersectional and intergenerational conversations on screen, which are both relatable and entertaining, but also teach us a lot about how to have those stories in our own life and those conversations in our own life, but also how do we talk about climate in a way, like climate is the most intersectional issue of our time. Every single thing that all of you care about in this room intersects with climate, and I know the people in this room kind of already realize that, but a lot of people don't. They think that their, their passion for racial justice or their passion for reproductive justice or any of these other issues, are separate from the climate movement, and they aren't. And so it's like, how can we pull that into our storytelling on screen, and how can we take a story that might be about racial justice and pull in climate narratives into that? So I think it's about combining all of those.
And I'll add one other. So I was recently training a group of writers in the UK, and we're talking about it, and there was this penny drop moment when I said, you don't have to say climate. You do not have to say climate. In fact, you don't even have to weave in climate. We need millions of more parables of how we get ourselves out of this. And human beings all through history, all through religion, have learned from parables. And we need 1 million parables of a group of people who create a problem, struggle with admitting that they've created it, and then come together in innovative ways to solve it. 1 million ways of that human journey of accepting the challenge and acting on the challenge. Because actually, those are the stories which are going to get us out of this, not a whole lot of documentaries around climate change which help inform and educate, but for the people who are never ever going to click yes or click next on a property that says climate on it, we have to reach them with the same solves as we're telling the climate community. We've got time for another question. I've been so pathetic giving out on pointing. Thank you so much for making the choices.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Jamie Cummings. I'm with Youngo, which is the youth constituency to the UN climate movement. And my question is related a little bit to what we were talking about with individual blame and also with the fascist narratives that you all have received. So like you were talking about, we know that we've received the narrative from fossil fuel companies that this is an individual problem and you have a carbon footprint. And one thing that I have seen on carbon footprint calculators, for example, is the best way to reduce your carbon footprint is to have one less child. And I think as a young woman especially, this is a really striking example of a way to reduce my carbon footprint, because it's not the same decision as buying an electric vehicle or being vegan or not using a plastic water bottle. So my question is, how can we assuage this guilt that many people feel and then turn to the narratives of climate fascism to move away from this fossil fuel narrative we've been told?
Wow, big question. Tory, you're there.
I mean, my thing is, like, I wish I had, so we got 1,000 stories submitted this year, and what I want to do is write a small little letter to the person and be like, I don't know if you know this, like, notes back to the author, just to let them know, because I don't think that they're doing it. And so I think, like, one of the main things that has to happen is meeting it head on. Like, really addressing the fact that this is a fascist narrative, and here's where it springs from, and here's the history of this. I think that's really important because it's seeping into folks that don't consider themselves fascist in any way, and they're either regurgitating it or like there's some, I don't know where that media or that idea is coming from. My R came up with I'm from Boston. So you could hear that a little bit. And so I just want to like meet it head on. So really, I want to do it on an individual level with the people who write, but I think it's something that like in your position and all of us, like when you hear about these narratives, you have to, push back on them strongly. I'll stop there.
And I think, I've also experienced that in writers' rooms where, especially if it's a future story, where they're like, oh, well, we'll just say that there should be less people on Earth. And it's like, I think it's about talking about how, I think a lot of people don't connect the idea to fascism to begin with, but they also don't connect that further to white supremacy. And it's like, that is, the core of why that idea is bad and is fascist. And so it's like, I think you really have to step a lot of these ideas back, which leads to challenging conversations. And I think that's also why we need to be portraying more of those conversations on screen, and that it is hard and that it's okay to get things wrong, but it's really about starting those conversations. But I do think most people are just mistaken that is the case, and I do think we are fed that by a lot of other outlets.
And please.
It also puts the onus on the individual as opposed to the system.
Yeah.
And when I'm working on a set, I want all my crew, I wish they would use reusable water bottles, right?
Yeah.
But in order to do that, I have to have water filling stations.
Yeah.
And so it becomes this big change that needs to happen at the top. And I think it's the same for that. To say I have 3 children, he has 3 children, to say you should have a limit on your children is not putting the responsibility on the system, which is what we all need to look at and change and find ways to change it from the top.
One of my hopes is that as more amazing storytellers come into this world telling fantastic stories about the world we want to live in, we'll realise that the fascist stories just suck. They're just bad. It's bad storytelling, and good storytelling. Like a story always beats a fact, and a good story always beats a bad story. Folks, I'm afraid that we're at time. The one thing which I would leave you with, and this is drawn from what we've heard across the whole panel, is every single one of you is a storyteller. In this room, online. You do not have to have the job title or the novel published or the screenplay. You are telling stories every single day. You are going to tell stories about how you met Tagada at Solutions House. And when you tell that story, you're going to encourage people to come to Solutions House because they're going to want to meet Tagada. You're going to go out there, you're going to tell the story about why you do this. Why do you care? Why are you working in this? What was it about your life experience, your children, your friends? Tagada, that's not pretty. What is it that's drawn you to work in this? Please stop speaking in the third person and become the characters that we need to solve this, because every single one of you is a walking story and the world wants to hear those stories. I know that I do. Thank you so very much. Thank you to Kat, thank you to Tory, thank you to Ali. Fantastic.